like, I don't think anybody is going to deny that nothing illegal occurred here, right? So we often also volleyed back and forth this idea that maybe they just had the wrong charges, right? If they had said that they were blocking critical infrastructure, I think we could all agree on a guilty verdict at that point, because they basically did. I don't even think that they would deny that. They could have just pled guilty right away and we could have avoided this entire trial. But that's not what happened. They went with conspiracy to commit murder of RCMP officers. And then that opens up a whole other Pandora's box, where Marco Mendocino and David Lametti and many others said that this was the justification for the Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
And I tend to believe that as well, that they basically crafted this entire narrative that these guys were dangerous terrorists when they absolutely weren't.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Johnny Says So. And my guest today, returning for the second time, is Alex Zoltan, a crime reporter for True North News. And he has some exciting stuff to break with us tonight about the Coutts trial, which is the Freedom Convoy blockade in Alberta, and the subsequent trial that followed. So, Alex, it's an honor to have you back on the show, man.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So, I understand you have the documents.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Awesome.
I have
so it's not Alex Jones that has the documents. Alex Zoltan has got the documents, everybody. So what did we learn?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had attended much of the trial myself, not as much as I would have liked. So I don't know if I learned a whole ton. I mean, it's 6,909 pages. So I read through 700 over the last 2 days. I learned some really interesting things about pretrial that I wasn't privy to originally, because I wasn't there for pretrial. I was working as a banker at that time. So that's mostly what I read about yesterday, and I can talk to you a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so for people who don't know, this was the story that actually got you into journalism, correct?
Yeah. Yep. That was the thing that gave me the bug, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard not to have the bug when you're dealing with such a matter like the Freedom Convoy. I'd be really interested to get into this, because everybody, when they think of the Freedom Convoy, they think of Ottawa and the trauma that was inflicted on the residents there for hearing the honks and the phantom honks. But Coutts is the thing that sort of framed the narrative for a lot of Canadians that, these were violent extremists. That's the painting that the mainstream media here, the legacy media, like to paint. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that, because originally the headlines were that, these people were domestic terrorists and they actually were involved in a plot to murder RCMP officers. Those are some pretty serious allegations, right? And those charges ended up getting dropped. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, maybe.
Sure. So there were originally 13 arrests, if my memory serves me correctly. A lot of people don't know that there were that many arrests. 4 of them were charged with conspiracy to commit murder of RCMP officers specifically. 9 of them have all kind of seen their charges fizzle out. I've spoken to a few of them. They're actually kind of hard to track down when there's that many people. The Coutts gentlemen, I'll correct you a little bit. So 2 of them had the conspiracy to commit murder charges dropped. 2 of them ended up going to trial for those charges, and they were deemed not guilty on those charges. However, they were deemed guilty of possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose, as well as some other charges, which we can get into later.
Absolutely.
An interesting thing about the case is, if they were deemed, and actually the judge even had trouble wrapping his head around this, if they were deemed not guilty on conspiracy to commit murder, it wasn't exactly clear what the dangerous purpose was.
Yeah, I suppose. And that's the thing that a lot of people, I think, were confused about. And, I certainly, when the news first broke, I was like, okay, well, this looks serious. They have weapons actually at the protest. That might be the dangerous purpose. But we came to learn that the weapons weren't physically at the blockade, were they?
No. So the weapons were in. So there's a famous picture, and maybe you can overlay it when you do post-production or whatever.
For sure.
There's a famous picture, I think it was of 12 guns, and there were some walkie-talkies and a machete, which is pretty much gardening tool. Picture the famous, I call it the infamous guns picture, which I think was, again, 12 guns and a machete and some walkie-talkies and a bulletproof vest. It was never shown in trial. I think it was just intended for media consumption. So we have never figured out where all of those guns came from. We know where a few of them came from, and two of them, I believe, came from what they called the bullet trailer. The reason they call it the bullet trailer is because that's actually the name for this type of, I think it's a fifth wheel. And that's about a 15 to 20-minute walk, very short drive from the protest. So the guns were never at the protest. They were safely and securely stored in this guy's trailer. And I believe it was Chris Carbert's trailer specifically. Of Lethbridge into southern Alberta, it's like going back in time 100 years. You're in real cowboy territory. So people normally have guns. There is actually still a bounty in Coutts for gopher hunting. So it isn't even particularly unusual for somebody to have a gun in that area in their bullet trailer. Where things went awry is Chris Carbert and Tony Oleanic, I can't speak for Jerry Morin and Chris Lizak, they ended up talking to some, I am told, attractive undercover officers and said something along the lines of, we have guns here for the unlikely event that officers shoot at women and children and we need to defend ourselves. So I suppose you could chalk it up to that is the dangerous purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that would be a dangerous purpose. I mean, one could argue that, like, if you're talking to an undercover officer, and even if you say, like, if officers harm women and children, I'm sure in a court of law you could still make the argument that they did say that they were they had intended to shoot police officers, right? But, like, where it gets squirrely for me is the undercover female officer. Now, from what you've ascertained from the court documents, is there any sort of reason to believe that maybe this was entrapment per se? Like,
oh, that's quite a claim. I don't know. I don't know for sure because nobody was there and they didn't bring any recording devices with them either. So it truly was a he said, she said type situation. And what I thought was particularly interesting, there were two undercover officers and they both had conflicting statements. So one person said, or do you have a bomb coming? And one officer said that one guy nodded and another officer said that they just smiled and looked at each other. So, like, the evidence was just so flimsy. It was the strangest thing. Now, one of the issues that you have with trial by jury is that when the jury renders a verdict, you don't get an explanation. Right? The jury doesn't tell you, well, this is why they were innocent on this and guilty on this. You just get the verdict. And so the judge himself, and actually this came up in, there's an element of court where when the jury is deliberating, the defense lawyers and the Crown will both kind of present their final arguments to the judge, just kind of for final approval. And the jury is not present for that. And Catherine Bayak was the one who said, she was the lawyer for Chris Carbert. She had also said it's kind of an all-in-one, the dangerous purpose and the conspiracy to commit murder charge. Because if there's no conspiracy to commit murder, what is the dangerous purpose?
Yeah, I'm kind of scratching my head on that one as well.
And the judge said, well, that would kind of be the worst possible outcome for everybody, because they're like, how do you explain that? And that's the outcome that we got. And for why we got that outcome, but we have it.
Yeah, that's pretty wild that possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, and it was off-site, secured legally and safely. So that's, yeah, but obviously, I mean, sorry, was that charge dismissed, or is that one of the ones that ended up sticking?
So what they ended up being guilty of was mischief. Everybody commits mischief practically every day. Mischief is literally the lowest bar of criminality in Canada, so that wasn't a big deal. And in fact, Chris Carbert ended up pleading guilty to the mischief charge because there was just no fighting that. I mean, you block a border, you've committed mischief.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get real. There was definitely some mischievous doings in February of 2022, but I mean, not without its cause, though. I mean, it's just, for me, the real crime here is how the government of Canada allowed it to get to this point. it's pretty
for sure.
It's pretty ridiculous, like, when you look back on it. Like, even if you want to argue that, COVID was something that we had to take seriously, I mean, dude, this was when the Omicron variant was going around. Most of the country was already vaccinated. You know what I mean? Like, even if you're like a hardline pro-vax, like
Right.
pro-lockdown, you know what I mean? It was over at that point. Like, the government ended up dropping the restrictions almost immediately afterwards in every province anyway. Like, it was almost like they were just too stubborn and too hot-headed. They needed to let it go for a few more weeks and clamp down.
Yeah, and I think, like, I forget who said it, but I thought it was really smart. They said we're at 81% vaccination rate, I think, in Canada at that point. At a certain juncture, it's a law of diminishing returns, right? Like going to do, like, strap down that remaining 90% and forcibly vaccinate them. And I actually have strong opinions on vaccines myself. I obviously hated the mandates, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, back to the charges. So they were both deemed guilty. Carbert pled guilty to mischief. Olenek was declared guilty by the jury. They were also both guilty of possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose, as we mentioned. And Olenek was also guilty of an additional charge, which was possession of an explosives device. Now, that sounds really scary unless you have context. So
I would like the
explosive
context.
The explosive device in question was 200 kilometers away from the protest, so a solid, over an hour drive. They go fast in Alberta, mind you. The reason that it was 200 kilometers away, Tony's father was a gravel quarry miner. So it was a small firecracker that you would use for gravel quarry. And it was left over in a tower with his other stuff because he had passed away under a floorboard. Tony Olenek had no idea that it was there. And I don't believe that the explosive device was even operable at that point. It was very old.
Okay, well, because if that's the case, then how the newspapers described this was very disingenuous, because I don't have as much context for this as you. Like, I know exactly what everybody else does from reading the legacy media, and I was under the impression that it was a pipe bomb.
Yeah, it's not a pipe bomb. It's I'm not an explosives expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it's what I believe they call in the gravel quarrying industry a firecracker. So it's something that you would use to start gravel quarrying. It's
like for blasting, like to clear bedrock, maybe.
Exactly.
Wow.
That's my understanding. Yeah, you wouldn't really even be able to use this as a weapon, I don't think, even if you wanted to. And again, it was 200 kilometers away from the protest, under a floorboard, in a Tupperware bin, along with his deceased father's other belongings. That was the fact that he was guilty of that, and that they even pursued that charge was rather mystifying for all of us.
Wow, that's absolutely wild. So he didn't know it was there. This was just something that came up when the residence was searched?
Exactly.
And
then later on, we can talk about later on, the CBC said that he had a compound, and it was a gravel quarrying pit on his property. And then they made it look like it was this Osama bin Laden style,
like, terrorist training camp
in the mountain.
That's insane, dude.
And they also presented him as a white supremacist, which is hilarious. Well, it's not hilarious. It's just ironic, because Tony's mother is Filipino, and Tony is visibly not white. So
yeah, man, just the way they tried to
really
paint.
Sure how the CBC. Yeah, it was the most surreal experience you could possibly have, I think, in a criminal trial in Canada.
Wow. So I'm sorry, like, the pipe bomb charge ended up sticking?
Yeah, he ended up being guilty of the pipe bomb charge somehow. And again, I don't really know how the jury got to a guilty verdict on that, but they did. So
that's absolutely unbelievable. So if it wasn't for this this quote unquote pipe bomb, they would just have a bunch of mischief charges.
Mischief and possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose. And that was explained to the courtroom by Stephen Johnston, who is the lead Crown prosecutor in the case. Basically, what he said is, in Canada, we do not have what they colloquially referred to in the United States as a stand your ground law, right? And so in the United States, you absolutely can possess a weapon for the purpose of self-defense. In Canada, you have no such right.
Not even in your own home, let alone like
no,
at a protest. But yeah.
Yeah, and again, it wasn't at the protest, but the example that was used. This is how absurd the law works in Canada. If you were to pick up a kitchen knife and say this would make a great weapon to fend off a home intruder, you are technically in possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, and you could be charged.
Yeah, 100%. And it's actually funny, like not to go too far off topic, but it's very interesting that Doug Ford of all people, did you hear this? Like Doug Ford is the victim of crime, and so all of a sudden we have Canadian politicians now talking about like maybe we do need like a castle doctrine, like a stand your ground kind of rule here in Canada.
Yeah, it seems unlikely given the outcome of the Coutts trial that will ever be allowed. But yeah, I mean, it's so I guess if I can give any of your viewers one piece of advice to take from this, it's that if you own a weapon, obviously the only reason that you own a firearm is for sporting or hobby. Never say that you own any kind of weapon for the purpose of self-defense. In fact, if you have a baseball bat in your car, make sure you have a glove and a ball in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if women out there are listening and you want to carry dog spray for the purpose of fending off dangerous dogs, because you never know. There's a lot of dangerous dogs roaming the streets of Canada. So stay safe from rabid dogs.
Yeah, but just just say well, I don't know what you would say. Yeah, I think you can defend yourself from animals.
I certainly hope so.
I'm not so sure anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, another really interesting thing in the Coutts documents, especially from pre-trial, was the Voad Deer related to the interrogation video of Chris Carbert. So a Voad Deer, for legal laymen, is basically a trial within a trial, and it references whether a piece of evidence is admissible in the main trial. And the reason that this Voad Deer came up was because, and I don't want to get too into like the personal details, but basically Chris Carbert was sick and needed medicine. And the police did not give him his medicine, but proceeded to interrogate him anyway. So he was in a state of extreme distress. And you can actually see that. I don't know how the CBC got a hold of his interrogation video, but they included it as part of their Conspiracy and Coutts documentary, providing no context, of course, as to the fact that he was sick in the video. And he looks angry. And he looks, I would say, vulnerable. You might interpret that as threatening because he's kind of a big guy. But if you actually had the context that he was sick, then it just completely changes everything. And I believe that interrogation video ended up being not admissible, but Tony Oleanek's was. So I found that really interesting, that the police failed to get him his medicine and then proceeded to interrogate him anyway.
Yeah, so it's good though that that was deemed unadmissible.
Yeah. I mean, and the judge was good. I have to say, like, I actually really liked, his name was Justice Davis Lebrenz, and he was a good judge. I thought that he was fair, and he's not responsible for the jury's verdict. I actually thought that he was incredibly sympathetic to the defendants as well. So I think he was a little bit disappointed with the result. Probably wishes that they were fully acquitted. But such is a trial for a jury.
Probably. I mean, it's as much as our former prime minister likes to paint these people as part of a fringe minority with unacceptable views. I think there's actually a lot more sympathy and support for this than the media likes to admit.
I would agree. And the Conspiracy and Coutts documentary as well, what's funny about it is it received very few views. Like, if you go onto YouTube, I think it's probably one of their least watched documentaries of all time. And I imagine the only people that are watching it are critical thinkers like you and I. Like, I think that the narrative was so flimsy that they tried to present that the general public just didn't care or just didn't buy it. And so the only people really interested in this story, again, are critical thinkers and people who maybe are a little bit less trustful of the government. And that's why I appreciate you having me on to talk about it, and we're keeping the story alive, because two of the men are still languishing in prison, of course.
Yeah, I think that sentence is a little stiff for mischief, I think. Like, what, 6.5 years?
Yeah.
And does that include any time served? Like, so...
Yeah. So it did include time served. All of the men were denied bail. Even the two men who had the main charges dropped, they were held in pretrial detention. They call it remand. It's the worst form of prison. So actually, it's so terrible, remand, because you don't have regular prisoners' rights, that the judges and the legal system in Canada generally gives you time and a half. So for every day that you serve in remand, you get 1 day and a half day against whatever sentence you're given later on. And so they should be out, I think, within the next 16 months.
Okay, well, good for them. Yeah, no, it's just this no bail thing. Just it really rubs me the wrong way because I feel like every day I'm looking through the news, somebody posts on X, we hear horrible, horrible stories of repeat offenders in this country who are out on bail for some egregious violent crime, and just to think that these guys are, I don't think it's too harsh. I don't think it's too like out there to call them political prisoners. I think that's exactly what they are.
Oh, I would agree completely. The way the bail system works, I can maybe demystify that a little bit too in Canada, is that there are 3 reasons why you would be denied bail. The first one is called primary grounds, and that's basically flight risk, right? So if they're afraid they're going to, take off to a different country or just disappear and not come back for their next appearance, that would be a reason to deny bail. The secondary reason would be that you're a threat to society, right? So they're afraid you're going to reoffend. Neither of those applied in this case. What applied in their case was something called the tertiary grounds of bail, which is that it would give the legal system disrepute to give them bail. So the logic there, and I know it doesn't make sense.
I'm already lost.
The logic there is that the charges, conspiracy to commit murder of police officers, are so egregious that it wouldn't make sense to give them bail. Right? So we can't give them bail.
Yeah, see, I agree with that sentiment, though. Like, conspiracy to commit murder against cops, those sound like absolutely dangerous people that shouldn't be given bail. However, was the decision not to give them bail based on this charge that was dropped? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the strangest thing because we never really did hear. Like, I'm a fairly open-minded person. So the reason that I went to trial is I wanted to see if there was a smoking gun here. Surely there must be a smoking gun. And where did this charge come from? And I sat there for weeks, and we all did. Everybody in the gallery and the media, Robert Krychek, who worked for Rebel News at the time, we were all waiting. Every day we'd go out after trial and say, is it coming? Like, what is the evidence of conspiracy to commit murder? We never saw any evidence that suggested there was any plan. What they also did is they presented this theory that when they were talking to each other via text message, for instance, they had said, we should bring hockey sticks because they wanted to play road hockey at the blockade. They said that was code for machine guns. Or they said, let's bring, what was the other one? I think they wanted peas and carrots or something because they were cooking at the Smuggler's Saloon. And they said that was code for explosive devices or something. So it was the strangest thing. They basically suggested that these 2 simple-minded Albertans came up with an Enigma-style code so complex that it was completely indecipherable. And it was surreal. I really have no other words for it.
It sort of just sounds like, to me, though, just like some regular Canadian guys wanted to play some road hockey and eat some peas and carrots. Mind you, they wanted to play road hockey on the highway that they were blocking. So, maybe that's, again, we're back to the mischief, but...
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I don't think anybody is going to deny that nothing illegal occurred here, right? So we often also volleyed back and forth this idea that maybe they just had the wrong charges, right? If they had said that they were blocking critical infrastructure, I think we could all agree on a guilty verdict at that point because they basically did. I don't even think that they would deny that. They could have just pled guilty right away and we could have avoided this entire trial. But that's not what happened. They went with conspiracy to commit murder of RCMP officers. And then that opens up a whole other Pandora's box where Marco Mendocino and David Lametti and many others said that this was the justification for the Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
And I tend to believe that as well, that they basically crafted this entire narrative that these guys were dangerous terrorists when they absolutely weren't because they needed a boogeyman to justify it.
Oh, 100%. Because you look at what went on in Ottawa, there's no justification for the Emergency Measures Act. I mean, you didn't even... Granted, the police in Ottawa didn't really want to kick them out. That's my understanding. You know what I mean? You'd be hard-pressed to find officers that were willing to get their hands dirty and actually crack down on the protests in Ottawa because they were peaceful. They were leaving lanes open. You know what I mean? I'm so sick and tired of this narrative that, like, the people of Ottawa were prisoners in their own city. Like, you can go back and, like, I wasn't there, but I was cheering it on from Nova Scotia. Every night I was watching live streams, and, like, people were just walking around with cameras. You could clearly see lanes open and traffic, albeit slowly. Absolutely, it slowed people down. It certainly did inconvenience them. But, like, nothing was blocked in Ottawa, dude. Like, there's no justification for the Emergencies Act. The way you say that makes perfect sense. Now that I'm, like, thinking back on the timeline of events, you wouldn't have had the Emergencies Act if you didn't have that terrifying picture of the guns on the table. Because, I mean,
which never even showed up in trial.
Okay, so if that photo didn't show up in trial, then that just, that sends my spidey senses tingling a little bit. That should have been front and center. That should have been the Crown's, like, centerpiece.
We still don't know who owned those guns. We have no idea.
That's absolutely egregious, dude. Like,
Yeah,
no, this thing's more corrupt than I had even anticipated.
Yeah, and I'm so glad to have the 6,909 pages because so many of the elements of this trial were just unbelievable, right? That it was really hard to even convince people that it worked out the way that it did.
Yeah, but that's the thing, though, because the damage is already done. Like, the story has fizzled out. Like, this video is probably going to get a few hundred people watching it. You know what I mean? And I've got to be honest, I'm speaking to people that already know half of this stuff anyways, so there's a little bit of confirmation bias there. Like, most people have just moved on. And I want to give you props for keeping this stuff alive, dude. Like, it's you're doing real good work here, man. So,
well, same to you. I appreciate you keeping the story alive as well, because it is important, and there's still 2 guys in prison. So,
yeah, they're still in prison. They need to get out. And this story needs to be heard. And I think it's very important that we don't forget this, too, lest it ever happen again.
So I also did a FOIA, Freedom of Information request from the CBC with regards to conspiracy in Coutts. And it's a 262-page document that is 95% redacted. Redacted absolutely everything. It took them 6 months to give it to me. So it's very confusing. I'm not really sure why it took them 6 months, given that all they did was just blank out, like, 300 emails.
So is it even legible then? Like,
no, not at all. No, there's just like every once in a while you'll just see, you're doing great work, Bob. And then everything else is blanked out. So it's really, really bizarre. I don't think that anybody from their organization wants to take ownership of it either. And for good reason, frankly, right? It's a CYA thing legally, in case anybody, hypothetically were to file an appeal or were to, sue the CBC, which I personally think that these suspects should do, because they tainted their right to a fair jury trial. Yeah. Right? They protected these 13 guns. Everybody in 2024 still, I think, had a pretty fresh memory, at least in Southern Alberta, of the Coutts story. Another weird thing is that Diagolon almost never came up in trial at all, but it was the main crux of the narrative from the CBC. So we still have no explanation on how they came up with that narrative or why they continued it from February 2022 all the way to November of 2024, even though everything in trial showed that it just didn't hold water.
Oh, that's the story that just won't die, too, like this Diagolon thing. I don't even think I said it right, because that's just how irrelevant it is to any of this. Like, yeah, Pierre Poilievre, actually, oddly enough, you might remember... One thing I wanted to ask you, and excuse my ignorance on the case, but the Coutts blockade for most of the time, like, they didn't leave lanes open most of the time, right? Like, or did they? Like, it was, did they slow the traffic down, or did they block it completely? And if so, for how much time?
So as I understood it, they blocked both lanes for a while. And then what happened was they decided to open one lane. And that was because some of the truck drivers, like they were diabetics or whatever, and they needed their insulin. So they wanted, that makes good sense. They just wanted to slow things down. I don't think their intention was ever to, bring society down. Funny thing that came up in trial, speaking of bringing society down, and I really hope that, like, Tony Oleanic doesn't get mad at me for mentioning this, but there was one point where the Crown prosecutor said these men's intention were to take over the country and split the Crown land up between them. And people who knew the defendants laughed in court because they were like, these are just really, really average people. Like, there is no way that they ever had it in their minds, delusionally, that they were going to take over the country and split the Crown land between them. Somebody had said to me, like, I don't even know if that guy packs his own lunch. So it was just absolutely insane to experience.
Yeah, and like back to that whole Diagolon narrative that they like to spin, because that's why I asked about blocking the borders, because I don't know how familiar you are with we had like some smaller, much smaller scale protests here on the East Coast. Like we actually had our own border blockade here for a minute between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And at one point, Pierre Poilievre was driving through and he decided to like, this wasn't during like our big blockade, but Pierre Poilievre drove by some like, just some people hanging out with like their F Trudeau signs, and he decides to like pull over and talk to these guys to be like, hey, you know, maybe these are PPC bros, maybe I can win them over. And like there's this photo of Pierre Poilievre walking out of a trailer looking sort of like maybe a little bit disgusted that he just like walked into this trailer with the common people, but seriously though, there's a little like somebody had written the Diagolon symbol on the door. And like this story just followed him for weeks. People were just like, there he is hanging out with the white supremacists. You know what I mean? Like it's just absolutely ridiculous how irrelevant this Diagolon group is. And it just seems to follow Pierre Poilievre like everywhere he goes, because it doesn't help that the leader of Diagolon, that Jeremy Mackenzie guy, has a photo with Pierre Poilievre, right? He's shaking his hand. Ooh, how salacious. But you know what? Maybe I'll overlay this one here because I have a photo with Pierre Poilievre. You know what I mean? Like there's a picture of me shaking hands with Pierre Poilievre. And I can guarantee you that that guy has no association with this show. And if he bumped into me again, he would not remember my name or what we talked about. Guaranteed.
Well, one of the more entertaining things, again, I've only read 700 pages of the 6,909 pages, so it's going to take me a while. But another really funny thing that I found in there yesterday was at one point, I believe it was Rankin, who is one of the other Crown prosecutors. He wasn't the lead Crown prosecutor, but he says, Your Honor, we have an issue. Somebody in the gallery is wearing a Diagolon t-shirt. And the judge says, Sir, he goes, may you please turn your shirt inside out? I had to turn his shirt inside out. That was one of the only times it got mentioned in court. So it really was like just a nothing burger at the end of the day. And it also seems odd to me too that because Diagolon came up in the House of Commons more than it came up in the Coutts trial. If you recall, Justin Trudeau brought it up several times in the House of Commons.
Incessantly, dude.
And now that he's gone, it's like it just doesn't matter anymore, as if the threat was just merely a figment of the Prime Minister's imagination. And I think it probably was. Right? There are competing theories. Some people think that it was a psyop by the government. I think that Justin Trudeau just got it in his head that these were dangerous individuals, when I think they're mostly harmless. And you know, they're just people with I do believe that they have genuinely unacceptable views. I do want to say that, you know, they posted videos of Indians being hit by trains and stuff. I don't think that's acceptable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. 100%. Like they're talking shit online. You know what I mean? And it's gross. It's gross. I'm not down for it. You know what I mean? But it's like to think of them as a threat is absolutely asinine, dude. Yeah, but like that whole Diagolon t-shirt thing in court, like that sounds like something out of The Simpsons. Like that doesn't even sound real. Like
I know.
It's like that scene where Homer, you know what I mean? Like he's wearing the glasses. It's just like, take those off and those. Like, just doesn't sound like something that happens in real life, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of moments like that because it really was like a Simpsons style trial, in the sense that there was so much interest locally. And so the gallery was often full. There were many times, in fact, where you couldn't even sit in there because there was just no seats available. So people would take turns and give up their seats. And these were just largely senior citizens who just couldn't believe what they were witnessing. And I remember at the beginning of trial, every day the sheriff would come up and he'd say, like, okay, everybody, like, you have to be on your best behavior. We've had a lot of disruptions lately. Sometimes people would scoff, or they'd say, like, oh, this is bullshit, or, so on and so forth. So there was like some comedic elements to the entire thing. They also put them in a prisoner's box, which was really strange. So they put them in this like glass enclosure cage, as if they were dangerous criminals. They were originally shackled, their arms and legs, when they came into the prisoner's box. And there's a rumor that they built this box specifically for the Coutts trial, as if these guys were like Hannibal Lecter type characters.
I was just going to say that conjures up imagery of Hannibal Lecter, like leading them in, you know what I mean? With like what do you call it? Like a bite plate to make sure.
And then it was really funny because, there was like some women who are a little bit older, like kind of treated them like rock stars, and they were sending them love letters and stuff. So I remember one trial that Tony came into the prisoner's box and started blowing kisses to the women, and like he was Elvis Presley, and very, very strange.
Yeah, that's super strange. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to compare these guys to serial killers or anything like that, but like there's something very strange about that dynamic, eh? Like how just the bad boy, like behind bars, sort of gets like all this attention from females. It's sort of strange. Like who was the healthcare shooter in the States? What was his name?
Ted Bundy?
No, not Ted Bundy. The guy who unalived that that CEO in New York City. What was his name? Luigi. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the newest one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a whole other psychological phenomenon that's probably beyond my scope. But yeah, women do have a tendency to fall in love with serial criminals. But in this case, like Tony Oleanic, he had no previous criminal history. He didn't even have a speed ticket. Like, there's no reason to think of him as a dangerous criminal whatsoever. And in fact, he received, and this came up a lot in court as well, the judge received, he said, a mountain of referral letters from people who said, spoke of his high character. I spoke to someone he was an excavator, Tony. So somebody had told me that he helped excavate their house after they had a house fire and did tens of thousands of dollars of work for them for free. I mean, he was really just a champion member of his community in every possible regard. His mother's a sweetheart. Chris Carbert's mother is a sweetheart as well. I met her. Both of them are really, really nice, exemplary people. And I forget who said it, but he said, if I could have a neighbor, if anybody I would want as my neighbor, it would be Tony Oleanic. He's kind of the ideal neighbor. So yeah, they really, I think, kind of picked the wrong people, frankly. Like, you think that they could, I guess that kind of shows you how safe and good Canada really is.
Yeah, 100%. Like, these are our domestic terrorists, right?
Right.
It's like it's crazy, like, to say that out loud. Like, here, I never thought I'd be like doing an internet show where I'm defending Canada's domestic terrorists, but this is where we're at. Like, this is what these people tried to paint these people as. Like, it's so nakedly transparent.
Yeah, it is. And I think the shameful thing about it, and this is again why I'm so grateful for you having me on and keeping this story alive, is that people have a very short attention span, right? So a lot of people are just going to let this go. I'm not. I've gone this far. I feel like I'm obligated now to take this story to the end. So I will be filing an appeal with the Information Commissioner on those CBC FOIA documents to get more information. I want to know where the Diagolon narrative came from. It obviously didn't come from anywhere. Nobody wants to take ownership for it. I will keep working on it. Hopefully I can find some answers. But
yeah, and hopefully when those boys get out of jail, they follow up with the CBC as well, because yeah, like you said it in the beginning, like I don't think that they would have been as successful painting this narrative if it wasn't for that photo. So where did that come from?
Yeah, it came from, I believe, the Fort McLeod RCMP is where it came from. And we don't know where all of these guns came from. I've talked to policing experts. They said the photo was very strange, just the way that the guns were even split up. Now, mind you, as a crime reporter now, I can tell you that police do this a lot. And I think it's just a public relations optics thing. So, for instance, I can give you an example, a very recent one. In Ontario, they did a big child luring probe where they basically announced that they had arrested 27 people. It was kind of a to catch a predator style sting. But I had actually reported on several of these individuals being arrested individually over time. And then they just put it out all as one big announcement, as if they were all arrested at exactly like simultaneously, which was not the case. And I think it's just, again, a public optics thing to make it look like the police are more efficient and effective than they actually are. Again, I'm really glad that the police are getting child predators off of the streets. That's great. But I guess I can give them a little bit of forgiveness on the Coutts thing because I can see them doing this in other venues as well. So it's not as maybe terribly unusual as it sounds.
Absolutely. Is it possible that maybe that, I don't know if anybody's bothered to reverse image search it, but like, is that maybe just stock photo of some guns from a different seizure maybe?
No, the picture is legitimate. I know, I'm fairly certain that we have a chain of custody on 2 of the weapons out of the 12 or 13. But again, that's only 2. And also, I believe that they acquired those weapons across 3 or 4 properties. So at the risk of repeating myself, in Southern Alberta, it's very common for people to have weapons. So if you go to 4 properties and you seize 12 guns, that's not terribly surprising. Like, many people in Alberta own 1, 2, or 3 guns, and many households have more than one adult in them. Right. So there's nothing particularly unusual about that either.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Like any serious hunter is going to have more than one firearm.
Exactly. And some of these guns, like the weirdest thing as well is that Tony Olenek and Chris Carbert, the only 2 that ended up going to trial, were not charged with having guns that were illegal or having guns that were not properly stored. So make of that what you will.
Well, I'm calling BS on it. That's what I think. Yeah, it's so preposterous. And back to this undercover RCMP officer, though, like, I don't have any evidence of this. And like you said, you only read 700 of the 6,000 pages. But like, this is just me putting my tinfoil hat on here for a second. But like, I'm not convinced that they would have said the things that they had said if it maybe weren't for the presence of this officer. Like, I don't want to accuse them of entrapment, but like, you know what I mean? Like, were they single? You know what I mean? Were they maybe looking to impress somebody? Because
so that actually came up a lot. And I apologize ahead of time, Johnny. I'm on like 10% battery. This is draining my battery real fast and I'm outside. So if I cut out, don't take it personally. It just means my phone died.
Gotcha.
But that's a really great observation that you make, and it did come up a lot in trial. But whether or not the term was this a honeypot, and a lot of people believe that it was. And I hope that I'm not speaking out of turn here, and that I'm not giving anything away that anybody wouldn't want me to. But allegedly, they were arrested on February 15th, which was between February 14th and 15th, which was Valentine's Day. And Tony had actually been writing a Valentine's letter to one of the undercover officers. So he was smitten by one of the officers. And there was a lot of discussion about the emojis that the undercover officers were using when they were texting back and forth with the boys, about whether or not smiley faces and winky faces were flirtatious, and whether or not that was ethical or not in the context of a potential honeypot. So your intuition on that question is right on.
Huh. Yeah, because I've always thought right from the get-go that this whole situation had eerie similarities to the Michigan case. Do you know what I'm referring to here?
Yeah, with Gretchen Whitmer, I think was her name.
Gretchen Whitmer, because she was, this was a lot earlier in the pandemic for my listeners who don't recall, but there were some anti-lockdown protests in Michigan, and they were actually picking up some steam, and then all of a sudden it hit the news that some men were arrested for an alleged plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. And, you know, this sounded terrible. You know, it successfully painted the narrative that anybody opposed to the lockdowns is a dangerous right-wing extremist. And then the story fizzled out of the news, and then it later was revealed that these men were completely set up by the FBI. Like, the FBI basically gave them the plan and got them to talk about it, and then they were arrested. Like,
yeah, it was something like 9 of the 10 guys were like FBI agents, and the 10th guy was like mentally handicapped or something. Right? It was basically, like a creation of their own doing.
And police in Canada have done that exact sort of thing way back during the War on Terror. But like the RCMP have infiltrated mosques and, gotten like mentally ill, mentally handicapped, like Muslim men to agree to a plot. This has happened. I think it was in Surrey, BC, in like the late
there was
the
one
late
in Victoria,
2000s.
the Nuttall family. Yeah, the Nuttall family, where they had planned. Actually, it's kind of funny because it's coming up to Canada Day. It was a Canada Day bombing plot, and they had basically come up with the entire plot, given it to this mentally handicapped couple to pull off, and then charge them, before they could pull it off. But obviously, none of the charges stuck because it wasn't their plot; it was the police's plot. Just totally baffling that they would even try such a thing. But
yeah, absolutely, I would call it profoundly evil that they would do something like that. And again, you look at the motive behind doing that. At the time, politically in Canada, you needed to drum up support for the war in Afghanistan. And you needed, like, there was a big culture of fear in making us, you had to sell the Canadian public that all these counterterrorism measures were necessary.
Yeah, and in a sense, there's that old saying, like, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So they needed to find somebody, right? So if you look hard enough for a boogeyman, eventually you'll just create one of your own.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what they did there, and that's even more so what they did in Coutts. But yeah.
Yeah. So to sum it all up, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think this whole thing was used to justify the emergency measure, the Emergency Act.
Yeah, which didn't end up working, of course, because they didn't still meet the definition of the Emergencies Act, because CSIS did not think it was an emergency. And then I also think that's interesting, well, as an extra little Easter egg, is that the director of CSIS resigned. Shortly, I think it was after the verdict was rendered in the Coutts trial. So I think that I will give him credit. I think his name was David Vigneault, if my memory serves me correctly. I don't think that he was going along with this, and I think that they very much wanted him to, and it was necessary in order to meet all of the legal requirements. But I sometimes am reluctant to give CSIS too much credit, because then the Coutts people will think I am CSIS. But I will. I will give them credit where it's due. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, I suppose.
Yeah, but that's the way it seems to go in Canada, doesn't it? I mean, like, you have a major story like this, and then you find out that the government wasn't being transparent and that they downright lied about some things, and then it leaves the news cycle and we never get accountability from these people ever. That's the way it seems to go.
Yeah, but I mean, that's why we have to keep working hard, right? And we have to keep asking the right questions and not giving up on these stories. Because that's the only way that we can hold people accountable. It's up to you and I, and we ultimately get the government that we deserve, right? So if we abandon this and people are not held accountable, that's as much on us as it is on anybody else. So again, I'm very thankful for you having me on to talk about this.
Yeah, that says it all, Alex. And I'm thankful for you coming on the show to talk about it, dude. Anytime, you got it. And that's my show for today, guys. Big props to Alex for all the work that he's doing and for coming on the show to talk about it. Make sure you smash the like button, subscribe, all that good stuff, and make sure you're following Alex at Amazing Zoltan on Twitter and follow True North News. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.